In this episode of Green Light, Yellow Light, Red Light, we're going over every position. Quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends for week 8. We're going over all the matchups. Why? Because I'm a little bit of a crazy person, but also because this week there are a ton of players on bye, so might as well go through it all. Let's get it started with quarterbacks. Green light first. Let's start with Bo Nix. First of all, the Broncos have the 7th highest implied total on the week. And as we know, this is just a great matchup. Bo Nix had the extremely high ceiling last week in that comeback against the Giants. But Dallas, they're giving up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the second most over the last 4 weeks. They're also giving up the second most passing yards per game, and they're tied for the second most passing touchdowns per game given up as well. So, Bo Nix, if you started him last week, congratulations on the win. You can probably put him in your lineup once again, and you'll be just fine. This week, Caleb Williams, another one, going into Baltimore, coming out of their bye. More competitive game. Lamar Jackson's back. But they've given up the second most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, the 5th most over the last 3 games, so they're still giving it up. They're tied for the second most passing touchdowns per game with the Cowboys. But it's also worth noting that Baltimore plays the 4th highest rate of single high coverage. And when you look at what Caleb Williams has done this year, 6.88 yards per dropback versus single high. And then you look at versus 2 high, only 4.85. Baltimore also plays the 3rd most man coverage, and Caleb does way better against man coverage too. 6.79 yards per dropback versus man versus 5.78 against zone. So they're going to be chasing points. They're 5.5-point dogs. I think this is a good spot for Caleb Williams to potentially bounce back after they've been so run heavy over the past couple games since their bye. Okay, let's get into some yellow light running backs. And by the way, guys like Dak Prescott, Drake May, Daniel Jones, Jackson Dart all have relatively tough matchups, but I am going to play them over these streamers that I'm about to go over, okay? Let's talk Jordan Love going into Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's giving up the most passing yards per game in the NFL. They're giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game as well. And you also look at what Jordan Love has done against single high safety coverage. The Steelers play the 2nd highest rate of single high coverage in the NFL. Jordan Love, 9.34 yards per dropback against single high, which is absolutely bonkers. You compare that to, his numbers against 2 high, 5.56 yards per dropback. Not nearly as good, but still pretty good. But overall, good schematic matchup for Jordan Love against Pittsburgh. Joe Flacco going up against the Jets. He has Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. We talked about him being a kid in a candy store coming into the week. Jets are in the top half of the league in fantasy points given up this season and over the last 4 games. This is not a matchup that you need to stay away from, right? The Jets have also been second to last in DVOA versus the pass. Sauce Gardner also dealing with the concussion. Who knows if he's going to play? So this could be a blow-up spot for that passing offense in general. Also, Aaron Rodgers in that game. This is a revenge game, by the way. He's at home. He's not going to Green Bay, but revenge game nonetheless. The Packers are giving up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. And they're pretty much a pass funnel because they're giving up only 3.59 yards per carry to running backs right now, but teams have thrown the most against the Packers. 39.7 pass attempts per game. The Packers also play the 10th highest rate of zone coverage. And you look at Rodgers' splits between zone and man, 7.95 yards per dropback versus zone, 4.4 against man. So that tells you what you need to know there. Pretty good schematic matchup for him. And then if you really need to, Michael Penix against Miami, 4th most fantasy points per game given up to quarterbacks. Miami is dead last in DVOA versus the pass. And it is worth noting that Michael Penix does play better against single high coverage, but Miami plays mostly 2 high. So there is that. Okay. So only if you desperately need a streamer. And then you got some risky streamers like Tua at Atlanta. I'm really not about this life at all. They're giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, the 3rd fewest over the last 4 weeks. Fewest amount of passing attempts against them, fewest amount of passing yards given up as well. Number 1 DVOA against the pass. I'm good. Marcus Mariota going into KC. I get the rushing chops are there that could help his floor, but KC's tough. 5th fewest fantasy points per game given up to quarterbacks, 3rd fewest passing yards per game. They're favored by a bunch. In this one, I don't love Marcus Mariota this week with Jane Daniels out. Let's move to running backs. Green light for DeAndre Swift going into Baltimore. On paper, this matchup looks awesome, right? Baltimore has given up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs over the last 4 weeks, the 6th most rushing yards per game, the 3rd most rushing touchdowns per game to running backs. They're also giving up production through the air to running backs, and Swift has looked pretty damn good over the last 2 weeks, this entire run game. But just to keep in mind, they were in the elements, right? They were very positive and neutral game scripts here. It's very possible that the Ravens are leading for most of this game with Lamar back. They're favored by almost a touchdown. in this game. So I think it's a solid RB2. I would temper expectations just a little bit because of game script. Like hopefully we see more usage in the receiving game like we saw before the bye, because he had at least three catches each week. I'm not overly concerned with Kyle Monangai joining the rotation because I think when a smaller pie, I think Swift will kind of like assume most of that, opposed to when there's a bigger pie, Monangai will start to really get in there, if that makes sense. So Swift is in my lineup, good matchup, but let's not hope that things just get away from the Bears. J.K. Dobbins going against Dallas. I feel like he's been a green light start over the last several weeks, and it didn't really work out so well, right? Almost 6 yards per carry last week for Dobbins, but failed to get into the end zone. That's really what it comes down to with him, right? Like, is he getting in the end zone or not? He is basically a 0 in the receiving game. So that goal line touchdown is very important. And the fact that he's a 0 in the receiving game is crazy to me in a Sean Payton offense. But regardless, it's really tough to sit running backs against Dallas. They're giving up the most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to the position, the 4th most over the course of the season. They're giving up 5.31 yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 weeks. That's 6th most. So with volume, with a potential touchdown this week, hopeful touchdown this week, I think Dobbins can come through for you with a solid week. Just understand that his floor isn't high. Just tough to keep him out of your lineup in this one, right? Especially in a game that it has the highest point total of the week at 50.5 points. And the Broncos themselves have the 5th highest team implied total as well. Green light for Cam Skattebo going into Philly. I'm just here to say that Skattebo basically just needs to be in lineups every week at this point. Like, if he does well this week, I'm just like not going to include him in these videos anymore because I try to keep just the studs out of it. And I think he's like at the point where he's going to be a stud. And 22 opportunities last week for Skattebo, right? His snap share definitely decreased in Tyrone Tracy's second game back, but he still ran a route on more than 50% of Jackson Dart's dropbacks. He had an 18% target share. And since week 3, Skattebo has a 17% target share. That's 6th among running backs during that span. He's the RB10 of the season. He's the RB7 since week 3, since he got the role. So he's balling. Philly's given up the 7th most rushing touchdowns per game, partly due to Skattebo's 3 touchdowns a couple weeks ago, but they're also giving up the 8th most fantasy points per game to running backs this year. Again, Vegas doesn't love the Giants, but like Vegas had the Giants with the lowest implied total going into Denver last week, and look what happened, right? I feel like they're going to surprise again, potentially. Let's talk Derrick Henry going into Chicago. Don't mess around. I know Henry hasn't got it done, but it all changes now. With Lamar back against a Bears defense that's given up the 3rd most rushing yards per carry, the 5th most rushing yards per game to running backs. Touchdowns, I think, are going to finally start to flow again. The Ravens have the 3rd highest implied total for the week. So this is where it starts, once again, for Derrick Henry. So get him back in your lineup. Let his new season begin after this bye week. Let's talk Rachaad White going into New Orleans. Rough game from Rachaad last week, but I just go back to the well. The Saints are not a good rushing defense. This is an overall good matchup. It was a weird game for White last week. 6 targets, 4 catches, but only 6 yards to show for it. And that doesn't happen usually with Rachaad White. He had 4 catches for 29 yards, 4 catches for 30 yards, 3 catches for 21 yards in 3 games prior. We should see that turnaround, especially given the fact that he was on the field for 91% of the snaps last week. I think the targets should be there given the lack of wide receivers for the Bucs. Despite the lack of weapons, like they still have the 5th highest implied total for the week. You know, the coaches did say that they want to share the work a little bit with Sean Tucker, but they always talk up Sean Tucker and they never give him the rock. So a little hard to believe for me. All right, some yellow light running backs. Rico Dowdle going against Buffalo. The Bills are favored by a touchdown. So game script can become an issue in this one. But this game is in Carolina. So a little bit of a higher chance of the game script not completely falling out of favor for the Panthers running backs. And, you know, while Dowdle and Chuba Hubbard alternated series last week, is it possible that given how much more efficient Dowdle was than Chuba, do they lean in his favor a little bit more this week? I don't know. But the Bills have allowed a ton of production to the running back position. It's hard to like consider Bijan Robinson's game in week 6 and then Derrick Henry's game in week 1. You know, they're ballers, right? But like you still had the combination of Kendre Miller and Alvin Kamara finding a ton of success against them in week 4. So given Rico's playmaking ability, maybe he can take advantage of the defense that's given up the 3rd most rushing yards per game, the 2nd most rushing touchdowns per game, the most yards per carry to opposing running backs, etc. So given all the teams on bye, like I don't see how Dowdle isn't in lineups this week. Similar thing with Breece Hall going into Cincinnati. Great matchup. But can you trust the Jets offense? Like it looks like Tyrod is starting, but without Garrett Wilson, are they going to be able to move the ball? The Cincinnati Bengals are giving up the most fantasy points per game to running backs, the second most over the last 4 games, second most rushing yards per game given up. They just all around cannot defend running backs. They're giving up more than 5 yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 weeks. So I'm treating Breece like a low-end RB2. He came through in good matchups he had in Miami and against Dallas in weeks 4 and 5. Hopefully we see that again this week. Let's talk Alvin Kamara against Tampa. And we talked about Kamara at length in the trade show, so I'll spare you. But the TLDR is that I think he becomes a player who sees 70% plus of the snaps moving forward, given the Kendre Miller injury. But this week, we really have to depend on the receiving ability because Tampa is a tough rushing defense. But they give up the 5th most receptions per game and the most receiving yards per game to running backs. So because he'll be on the field a lot, and hopefully running a lot of routes with the Saints chasing points, almost a full touchdown underdog in this game, we could see some production here this week, especially in PPR. Let's talk Isiah Pacheco going up against Washington. Brashard Smith got a lot of work last week, but it was all in garbage time in the 4th quarter pretty much. He only had 1 rushing attempt in the first half. Isiah Pacheco had 8, Kareem Hunt had 4. Pacheco has been the clear primary running back over the last 2 weeks. He played on 62% of the snaps in the first half of last week's blowout, 77% of snaps the week prior, and the Chiefs are now double-digit favorites over the Commanders team without Jaden Daniels on Monday night. That could mean a lot of volume. It could definitely mean Pacheco sees, another 15 plus carries, potentially goal line work, especially with Kareem Hunt dealing with an ankle injury. We don't know if he's going to play in this game or not, but it's very possible that Pacheco continues rolling with the extra opportunity that he's been getting over the last couple games. Let's start Quinshon Judkins going into New England. I think last week, obviously great game script, right? At home. He racked up those carries. He scored 3 touchdowns, but New England is favored by a touchdown in this game at home. So not the potential game script that you want to see. As long as the Browns can keep this game relatively close early, Judkins can potentially have some production and get into the end zone. But I will say that the Pats have been holding it down against running backs for the most part. 3.18 yards per carry given up on the year. That's the 2nd fewest this season. So just temper expectations a little bit on Quinshon Judkins. I think I'd rather play Jaylen Warren against Green Bay this week. I talked about how well Warren is playing and how bullish I am on him moving forward in the rest of the season. I think he's a solid RB2 start this week, but I would also temper expectations just a little bit against this Green Bay defense. They're allowing the 3rd fewest yards per carry to running backs. They're giving up the 3rd fewest rushing yards per game to running backs. They're not giving up touchdowns to running backs, really. The 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the position as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's a bit of a down week for Warren. We talked about Aaron Rodgers' matchup. Could be a little bit more of a pass funnel for them. But with that being said, given Warren's role in this backfield, he's still going to be targeted out of the backfield. He's still going to get volume. He's still going to be in my lineup. So many teams are on bye right now. So I put together a super desperate week 8 running back list for you, okay? Number 1, Jerome Ford going into New England, right? Talked about the potential negative game script there, but also the Patriots are giving up the 3rd most receptions and the 5th most receiving yards to running backs. So you're telling me there's a chance? Maybe. I don't know. It's just a dart throw, but these are all dart throws right here. RJ Harvey going up against Dallas. Good matchup. He's been pretty involved in the receiving game as well. Sean Tucker going into New Orleans. Super dart throw right here. The coaches said that they want to get him more involved. Who knows? I don't really believe them, but you're grasping at straws here, right? And the reason why I'm putting this list together is because I had to do this in a couple leagues this week, so I might as well share it with you guys. Brashard Smith going up against Washington. Maybe no Kareem Hunt, maybe a limited Kareem Hunt. Maybe he gets a little bit more work. Another blowout spot for the Chiefs. Maybe he gets some work. Chiefs are double-digit favorites in this game. Smith has also been pretty involved as a receiver in their regular offense, so he could have a little bit of a floor here. Only in PPR leagues, I should say. And then Tajay Spears going into Indy. The offense stinks, but Indy is 2 touchdown favorites. Seriously, 2 touchdowns. That could mean a lot of Spears on the field running routes. He could see a 65% snap rate in this one, just running a ton of routes. Maybe with 5 catches in this one. We'll see. I got a red light running back for you this week, and it's Rhamondre Stevenson. I've been talking Rhamondre Stevenson up, but going up against Cleveland this week, I do think that this is going to be all Rhamondre once again. I think the game script can be fine as well for the Patriots being up in this game. I think he can get volume. But even with a 75% snap share, for example, Cleveland is a very, very tough run defense. They're giving up only 3.48 yards per carry to running backs. They're giving up the 2nd fewest receiving yards to running backs, the fewest fantasy points per game to running backs. If you need wins now, and you maybe bought Rhamondre or you just had him and whatever, I've been buying Rhamondre because his value is way higher today than it was a week ago, 2 weeks ago. But if you want to sell now, at this point, I'm okay with it, because if you look at the matchups they have coming up, Cleveland, Atlanta, Tampa, not great, but if you can be patient, he has some great matchups in the fantasy playoffs against Buffalo, Baltimore, and the Jets. Just saying. All right, let's talk green light wide receivers. Okay, Stefon Diggs going up against Cleveland. And I get it. Like, it's been up and down. 40% plus target share, then 40% plus target share. Then a down week. It was like a booty game, right? And then Stefon Diggs bounces back with a decent game, nothing too crazy, but still a 30% target share, okay? So he is still a buy low, but he's also someone I want to start in this game. Why? The Browns play single high coverage at the third highest rate in the NFL. Stefon Diggs has a 3.85 yards per route run against single high. He's going to avoid Denzel Ward on almost half of his routes. He runs a ton from the slot as well. And even when he's on the perimeter, Browns are middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed. So not a matchup that we need to stay away from by any means. And I wouldn't look at last week's quote unquote, regular output as something that we should stay away from. They just didn't throw the ball as much as we'd like. 30% should be more than enough to get it done for Stefon Diggs moving forward. Courtland Sutton going up against Dallas. I kind of feel like I talk about Sutton way too much, so I'll just leave this with you that he has a great matchup and you should start him this week. Cowboys give up the second most fantasy points per game. They're tied for the most receiving touchdowns per game given up to wide receivers as well. The fourth most receiving yards per game given up to wide receivers. Oh, and the second most fantasy points specifically to perimeter wide receivers too. So I feel like I'll continue to talk about Sutton because I kind of feel like people don't give Sutton the respect that he deserves. I think a lot of people think that Sutton is just like this dude and he's kind of on the fringe every week, but he shouldn't be. He's in your lineup every single week. He's like borderline wide receiver 1. But anyway, Denver also has the 5th highest implied total for the week as it stands today as well. Another green light wide receiver, and you might not think it based on the last couple of games that he had, that's Romeo Doubs going into Baltimore. And, Baltimore is a matchup that you want to start your wide receivers against, specifically guys like Odunze, because they're giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and they're tied with Dallas and Chicago for giving up the most receiving touchdowns per game to wide receivers. But also Odunze, specifically, he is very, very good against single high coverage. Baltimore plays the 4th highest rate of single high coverage at 61%. Odunze is targeted at a 28% rate on a per route run basis against single high, 0.20 against too high. And as far as yards per route run goes, 2.38 against single high versus 1.48 against too high. Okay, so Odunze, good schematic matchup for him in this one. Let's talk Michael Pittman going up against Tennessee. Another good matchup for Pittman. The Colts have the highest implied total for the week, which is crazy. This team is insane. But Tennessee plays the 3rd most too high coverage, and we talked about Pittman against too high coverage before in previous weeks, but he's targeted at a 27% rate on a per route run basis against too high, only 0.20 against one high, 2.16 yards per route run against too high versus 1.38 against single high. So Michael Pittman, get him in your lineup. Jordan Addison going up against the Chargers. He's been low-key balling this year. He's been the wide receiver 11 in fantasy points per game since he returned from suspension. 17.4 fantasy points per game. And the Chargers, they play the 8th highest rate of too high safety coverage. And guess what? Addison's way better against too high. 3.34 yards per route run against too high. 1.36 against single high. 25% targets per route run versus 17% targets per route run. Okay, so way better against too high safety coverage. Both, by the way, higher than Justin Jefferson against too high. Jefferson's way higher in both categories against single high coverage. Interesting note there. Maybe Addison outperforms Justin Jefferson again this week? Maybe? Yellow light wide receivers. George Pickens at Denver. Listen, he's going to be in my lineup. George Pickens is going to be in my lineup. I'm just saying, Denver gives up the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Tough matchup. Temper expectations. With all that being said, CeeDee Lamb came back. George Pickens' target share did drop to 21%, which is still good enough for him to succeed in this particular offense. But CeeDee is playing way more perimeter this year than he was last year. Remember, he was like a slot guy, right? A lot more perimeter this year. So we're going to actually see a lot more Patrick Surtain on CeeDee than we're used to. Denver plays the 6th highest rate of single high coverage. And Pickens, again, single high demon. 3.69 yards per route run against single high coverage compared to only 1.14 yards per route run against too high, which is hard to believe because Pickens has just been balling. And also like 28% targets per route run against single high versus 0.14 against too high. Again, hard to believe, but he has been going up against a lot of single high primary teams. I'm starting Jaylen Waddle at Atlanta, but I'm a little worried. I'm not going to lie. It's a tough matchup, right? 2nd fewest fantasy points given up to wide receivers, so I'm tempering expectations. However, Waddle's overcome some tough matchups over the past couple weeks. Outside of last week, obviously, he couldn't overcome Tua and the weather this past week, but In weeks 5 and 6, 26 and 28% target shares. And Atlanta plays the most single high coverage in the NFL, 72.6% rate. And Waddle against single high, 0.3 yards per route run. Against two high, 0.18. 2.52 yards per route run against single high versus 1.94 yards per route run against two high. So good schematic matchup for Waddle. I trust him in this game, especially no Darren Waller in this game. Who are they going to throw to, right? Romeo Doubs going into Pittsburgh. They play the second highest rate of single high coverage. We talked about this with Romeo Doubs in the past couple weeks, for the last couple weeks actually. 62% of the time, Pittsburgh runs single high coverage, and Doubs is way better against single high coverage, 2.55 yards per route run against single high versus 1.37 yards per route run versus two high. So really, really good matchup for Romeo Doubs schematically. It's looking pretty good. Also, Pittsburgh gives up the fourth most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers this season. Quentin Johnston, a little bit of a fall off to a little bit of a dive these last two games. 13% target share in week 5, 10% in week 6. He was a top 24 wide receiver each of the first 4 weeks, top 6 2 of those weeks, and then outside the top 30 the last 2. The matchup this week isn't really up his alley. He's a single high guy. 2.28 yards per route run against single high versus 1.06 against two high. And Minnesota, they're a two high team. He was also targeted on 22% of his routes against single high, but only 16% against two high. And Minnesota, two high safety coverage is what they do. Highest in the league, 70% rate. I'll start QJ as a low-end wide receiver 2 this week, borderline wide receiver 2, but we should temper expectations. I think the guys that could eat in this game are Keenan Allen and Ladd McConkey. Wan'Dale Robinson going into Philly, yellow light here. He's simply been getting it done as Jackson Dart's #1 wide receiver. 32% target share over the last 2 weeks. You can't sit that type of target share, right? Even, if the matchup can be tough. The Giants found a way to get him matched up with other guys outside of Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. Maybe they do the same this week. Maybe the Eagles figure it out, given that they just played them a couple of weeks ago and it's in their house now. But it's worth noting that Philly has allowed the 5th most receiving yards to wide receivers at this point, the 6th most receptions to wide receivers, and the 11th most fantasy points to the position as well. And I would consider the last couple of weeks for Wan'Dale to be pretty tough matchups, but he came through. He came through big time. Xavier Worthy going up against Washington. Now, I don't really expect a competitive game. Neither is Vegas. So there's that. And Worthy hasn't been super amazing for fantasy this year. And his target rate might not be there with Raji around him. I guess I'm kind of talking myself out of starting him. But he does do a better job against single high coverage. 28% target rate and 2.61 yards per route run versus 17% target rate and 0.53 yards per route run versus two high coverage. And he's going up against a Washington team who runs a ton of single high. So could be a decent matchup for him. Maybe he gets one over the top. If you need a spot start, for at wide receiver, I put together a little bit of a list here. So Kayshon Boutte, right? His target rate doubles against single high coverage, higher yards per route run as well. Cleveland plays the 3rd highest rate of single high, solid dart throw this week. Hopefully he gets a long touchdown once again. Jalen Noel, most likely no Nico this week. Probably no Christian Kirk too. He only ran a route on 40% of dropbacks last week, but he was targeted on 27% of his routes. He was also targeted on 25% of his routes the week before. Okay, so with him expected to run more routes in this game, if Nico and Kirk both miss, I think he's a decent throw-in. 9.8 fantasy points in week 5, 11.7 last week on limited work. And by the way, he is a good wide receiver. DJ Moore, he's been a little bit better lately. More competitive game this week. They'll need to play catch-up. Just like Rome, he does a lot better against single high. Baltimore plays it at the 4th highest rate. 31% target rate against single high versus 16% against two high. So DJ Moore, you can throw him in and hope for a little bit of a better game from him. Josh Downs, no Colt is being targeted at a higher rate than Josh Downs' 27% this season. And against two high looks, that goes up to 29%. And Tennessee is a two high team. But overall, Tyler Warren is at 23%, Pittman's at 22%. So when Downs is out there, he is being targeted over all these guys. So high team implied total in this one, the highest among all the teams. But it looks like he is progressing through the concussion protocol at this point. So keep an eye on that. But it looks like he will be good to go this week. All right, let's talk through some green light tight ends. Dalton Kincaid, if he plays this week, he's a great start. The Bills have the 3rd highest implied total this week. Carolina gives up the 4th most receiving yards, the 5th most receiving touchdowns, the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. Cade Otton, no Mike Evans, obviously. He could be the #2 target behind Emeka Egbuka. 3 straight double-digit fantasy point performances at this point. The Saints are a relatively neutral matchup, so nothing to stay away from there. Aranda Gadsden, you just picked him up off of waivers. Really hard for me not to start him after last week. If I don't have one of the top tight ends, I want to put him in. Nothing super special about the matchup, but he's been balling over the last 2 games, and I'm riding the hot hand here. Let's move to some yellow light tight ends. Mason Taylor at Cincy. Keep in mind, he didn't practice on Thursday, so just keep an eye out for that. But since he has given up the most fantasy points to the tight end position, the most receiving touchdowns, the most receiving yards, maybe Tyrod Taylor, him starting can be a good thing for him this week. Harold Fannin, Njoku's back, but hopefully Fannin can continue to rack up targets. Patriots, they allowed the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends over the last 4 weeks, the 11th most receiving yards to the position as well. Browns will likely be in a negative game script, so this could be a decent game for Harold. Juwan Johnson, like Tampa, like they've given up the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends over the last 4 weeks, but and it's worth noting that Johnson, like obviously he was like one of like the must-start tight ends early on in the year, but he reclaimed a 23% target share last week, right? He was dominating targets earlier in the year, and then he had the ankle injury, so maybe he's back, right? Maybe it took him a little bit to get back. I think he can be considered a streamer once again, and if he gets it done this week, then like maybe he's just like back. Dalton Schultz randomly came through last week, right? And without Nico Collins this week, potentially he's someone you can look at. Maybe CJ Stroud's #1 target. Christian Kirk might miss as well. So, he's going to need to get rid of the ball, and Dalton Schultz has done it in the past, and maybe he can come through once again. And by the way, like I'm probably starting all these guys over like Zach Ertz, for example, especially if we see one of Deebo Samuel or Terry McLaurin play without Jane Daniels, because Deebo, like I think Zach Ertz is really just like Jane Daniels guy, especially in the red zone. So I would probably not play Zach Ertz, and I'll probably play one of these guys that I mentioned. But that's going to do it for this episode, guys. If you want the full rankings, go to upperhandfantasy.com. Follow me on Instagram at upperhandfantasy. We'll talk soon. See you later. Peace.